So speaking of world affairs and human rights, we're going to go on to another story. The UN has actually declared abortion and assisted suicide a, quote, universal human right. This is coming out of one of their committees that they put together, and this is a memorandum. Now, again, the UN has no binding authority. They don't have any actual legal power in the United States of America. It was kind of acted as though they did back in the Obama administration. They took, I don't know why, but they took what the UN said actually seriously. But I would like to point this out. First of all, the UN is wasting their time on stupid crap like this when the Asia Bibi situation is going on. If you're really worried about universal human rights, I would think the universal right to, I don't know, live would kind of be higher than this one. And also the human right to freedom of religion, which even the UN asserts is a human right, that would take precedent, that you would be working on that instead of working on this. But nonetheless, this is what the UN has come out with this week, which to me is just more evidence that the UN is absolutely completely worthless and we need to be out of the UN. I mean, I believe that for a long time. I believe that long before they did this, but this is just one more piece of evidence that is going onto that pile of reasons I don't think that we have any reason to still have a UN. I mean, so far as I'm concerned, we need to just go ahead and disband the UN, and the UN can still exist without America if they want to, but they're going to have to find another headquarters. They ain't meeting in New York anymore. That's how I would handle it. I see no reason why the United States benefits in any way from supporting the UN as much as we do, and we put forward a lot of that budget. Now, I'm perfectly fine with world leaders having a place to get together and talk. I'm perfectly fine with having summits, but we can have summits in New York City and we can have summits in other cities without necessarily having the UN, because the UN is this sort of quasi-governmental structure that you're not real clear on its authority, but the UN doesn't have any teeth. Whenever the UN condemns something, they just say that they condemn it. It's the US that goes in and cleans up the mess. And so far as I can tell, the UN just wastes a lot of people's time and money, and not just American dollars, but other countries' dollars as well. Well, not dollars, but currency, whatever. But the UN is just completely wasting everyone's time. And the memo stated that nations should, and I'm quoting here, that they should not introduce new barriers and should remove existing barriers, including barriers caused as a result of the exercise of conscientious objection by individual medical providers. So I want you to go through that. We'll go through the first part first. So they're not only saying that abortion should be a universal human right, but they're saying that if any country introduces barriers to them or does not remove the barriers they already have, in other words, if there's already barriers depending on the time, the timetables that we're talking about, for example, in most countries. This is actually not true on the federal level in America, but in most European countries, there actually is a limit on abortion after 25 weeks. There are only 6 nations that allow abortion after 25 weeks other than the United States. And so we're actually in the minority when it comes to that. But this memo is saying that those barriers need to be gotten rid of. We need to get rid of all those barriers. And it goes on to say, including barriers caused by the result of exercises of conscientious objection by individual medical providers. Okay. So, want to be clear on what we're talking about here. What the end of that memo just said, that if there is a barrier that is caused by a conscientious objection by a doctor, then that needs to be removed. So it's a roundabout way of saying it, but what they are saying is, governments, you force your doctors to engage in abortion, regardless of whether or not they believe in it. Because if you're removing that barrier to getting an abortion, and you're saying that barrier was created by the doctor saying that, well, I don't like abortion, so I'm not going to do abortions. What they are in a roundabout way of saying is, you have a doctor, you have a gynecologist, an OBGYN, you make that doctor do abortions regardless of whether he wants to or not. That is unconscionable. Especially when they're talking about universal human rights. Don't you have a right to your own conscience? For example, I'm not Catholic, I have no religious aversion whatsoever to the use of contraceptives. Now, Plan B is different because that's technically not a contraceptive. It kills a embryo that's already been fertilized. I'm talking about actual contraceptives that keep the sperm from penetrating the egg. Anything before the point of conception. I have no religious objection to that whatsoever. But you know what? I'm not going to force that belief on a Catholic that believes that contraceptives are bad. I disagree with him. But just because I disagree with him doesn't mean I want him to violate his conscience to suit me. I mean, to be honest, if I were married right now, because of the point I am in my life and the point I am in my career, if I were married, my wife would probably be on contraceptives. But if her doctor, gynecologist, OBGYN, whatever, said, I'm sorry, I can't recommend a contraceptive to you because it's against my religious belief, I'm fine with that. We either find a new doctor or find some kind of over-the-counter thing. That's fine. That to me is more important than violating the man's freedom of religion, violating his freedom of conscience. The UN is taking the exact opposite approach. They're saying that regardless of why the doctor don't like abortion, whether it's just because he understands that it's a person or he has some kind of religious objection to it, whatever it is, you make him do it. So the UN is putting the right to an abortion ahead of a person's right to free will and conscience. Their priorities are completely backwards when it comes to all of this. Also stated a little bit later in that same memo, young people should have access to contraception as well as guaranteed access to post-abortion health care in all circumstances and on a confidential basis. Now, you have to keep in mind, when we're talking liberalese, and that's the only language that is spoken at the UN, when we're talking liberalese, access means paid for. So in other words, if I don't have access to something, that means that I can't afford it. So if post-abortion health care, and I know I'm using the air fingers quotes a lot here, but I have to. If post-abortion health care, which is what we're talking about, you don't have access to it, what they are saying is it has to be paid for. So now they're not only saying that abortion is a human right and they have to be available, but you also have to have access to contraceptives and access to post-abortion health care. Yeah, you know what would negate the need for post-abortion health care? Not getting an abortion. And so that would solve the problem right out of the gate. And contraceptives, I'm all for people having access to contraceptives. I just don't want to have to pay for it. But typically when you're reading these government documents, which usually are written in liberalese, then what they're actually talking about is somebody else paying for it. So now the UN is telling countries that if you have a doctor with a aversion to abortion, you make him do it, that abortion is a human right, that you can't deny people from that. Oh, and by the way, you also have to pay for their contraceptives and you have to pay for any health care that they need after an abortion. They have lost their ever-loving minds. So let's go on a little bit further. Last year, the UN actually ordered Ireland to pay a woman $34,000 in American dollars for travel to get an abortion in Britain. So what's going on here is in Ireland, up until just several months ago, 3, maybe 4 months ago, abortion was actually illegal in Ireland. And you can understand that because they have a strong heritage of Catholicism. That's something they're kind of known for. And so because of that, they had a law that abortion was not legal. And during this time, there was a woman that went to Britain, went to the UK so she could get an abortion. The UN ruled that a human rights violation, that Ireland's law was keeping her from an abortion, and ordered Ireland to provide her money for therapy afterward, and ordered her to pay for her travel expenses and her medical expenses to England because they were denying her a universal human right. I got to tell you right now, if the UN came to the United States and I were a president or a member of Congress or whoever, and I'm receiving this letter, I'd have told them to shove it right then and there. No, the UN does not have any authority to tell a sovereign nation how they are going to spend their money. That is not the UN's job. And especially when you're trying to assert that there is a human right here. So let's go back to the, let's go a little bit meta. on this. Let's speak a little bit more broadly. Who gave the UN the right to decide what a right is anyway? That's the real question behind all this. See, that's the problem that is underlying this whole issue. The UN believes that it has the authority to grant people rights, that it has the authority to declare this is a human right, this is a human right, this is not a human right, which we've seen in this entire story, saying that you don't have a right to conscience, but you do have a right to contraceptives and abortion and assisted suicide, which is hilarious because they're saying, well, we believe in universal human rights. We believe you have a right to life. Well, unless, of course, you're in the womb, and we don't really believe that you have a right to life if you're considering suicide. Here's the thing about that. And the libertarian in me does feel a little bit of a pull between these two, because I do believe you have the right to do essentially with your body whatever you want to. But if we're talking about it from a moral perspective, for sure, God gave you the right to life. And you don't have a right to take the life of another unless it's in self-defense or something like that, which we clearly see examples of in the Bible. And you also don't have a right to take your own life. That is violence against yourself. And so you are violating a moral principle, and you are violating a human right by denying life to yourself. Denying yourself a right is actually a violation of God's law. And so, that being said, you are actually actively taking an action against yourself in assisted suicide, and you're also making the doctor an accomplice to that, which is another moral area that you get into some real tepid waters. Or not tepid waters, turbulent waters. But anyway, this all spurs from the idea that the UN has the right to say what is a right and what is not. Only God has that authority, which was asserted in the Declaration of Independence. Only God can grant you a human right. And the right to life and the right to an abortion cannot exist simultaneously. You either have a right to live or you have a right to an abortion. But if you have a right to an abortion, you are then saying you have no right to life, because it is saying that another person's life is contingent on whether or not you want them to be there, which by definition would mean all murder is now legal. Because if I don't want that guy there, I want him dead, who's to say that that's any different than aborting an unborn child? What's the difference? You are snuffing out a human life for your own convenience. That's no different than any other murder. And so you cannot simultaneously say that we have a right to life and a right to abortion. Those two things cannot be true at the same time. They are contradictory statements. And so this is one of the issues that the UN has run into. And honestly, for this alone, even if I had no other problems with the UN, this alone is an indication that we need to be out of the UN. I would be fine with us getting out of the UN for this incident by itself. Say, look, we assert that there is a right to life in the United States of America, and if you can't get on board with that, we do not need to be a member of your organization. Mic drop, walk away. That's how I would have handled it.